Okay, so I'm going to do a breakdown of the lottery just like I did for the pedestrian. This video is going to be sort of how I would present if this were a seated class and we're writing on the whiteboard. So, the lottery was written by Shirley Jackson, who lived from 1916 to 1965. She is best known for her novel The Haunting of Hill House, which was reimagined by Netflix fairly recently. And this story, The Lottery, is really her best known short story, and some of you may have read it in your high school classes. When it came out, it was published in the New Yorker magazine on June 26th, 1948. So it's an interesting thing. If you notice let me flip to this next slide, when the story, hang on a minute. When the story opens up, we get the morning of June 27th was clear and sunny. So the story being published in the New Yorker on June 26th was specific. The New Yorker people asked Shirley Jackson if she would set her story on that date, and she agreed. And so it's interesting, when the story was published, it was immediately controversial and divisive. And in fact, to this day, no other publication in the New Yorker, no other piece published by the New Yorker has gotten as much reaction and mail as The Lottery. People canceled their subscriptions. People were really upset by this story. A lot of people thought it had really happened and wrote in wanting to know where in the world would this take place. How horrible. So this story was, people noticed it right from the beginning. And you have to go back and remember, in 1948, a couple of things. This is just post-World War II. So people, I think, were tired of hearing negative, sad things in the news. And this is, a time, too, where people were not used to reading what we think of as dystopian fiction. This is a story which you should have read it before you listen to this video, and I'm just going to give that as a caveat. Spoiler alert, we will spoil this story in this video. So if you haven't read it, turn this video off, go back, read it, then come back and listen to my video, because I am going to spoil this story. So, this story has a little bit of Hunger Games vibe, if you know the Hunger Games. But there were no Hunger Games. There was no, the squid. None of that was in the public view in 1948. So this must have felt really shocking to people. I mean, it's still shocking now. Okay. So let's go ahead and we're going to look at, let me enlarge this. We're going to look at this first paragraph or two and talk about what we see in this story. So I'm going to read the first paragraph. The morning of June 27th was clear and sunny, with the fresh warmth of a full summer day. The flowers were blossoming profusely and the grass was richly green. The people of the village began to gather in the square between the post office and the bank around 10 o'clock. In some towns, there were so many people that the lottery took 2 days and had to be started on June 26th. But in this village, where there were only about 300 people, the whole lottery took only about 2 hours, so it could begin at 10 o'clock in the morning and still be through in time to allow the villagers to get home for noon dinner. All right. So if we flip over to the setting, and we start talking about the setting of this story, we learn a lot about where the story takes place from that first paragraph. It's a village square. We don't know where exactly, but as we read the story, we kind of get the feeling it's probably somewhere in New England, mostly from the dialect of the villagers in their conversation with one another and some of the choice of words that Shirley Jackson makes. So we know it's a village square. We know it's summertime, 27th of June. It's a beautiful day. It's in the morning. It's 10 a.m. It's a very everyday, normal scene. A lot of just sort of beautiful imagery and description in this first paragraph. It feels normal, so to speak. But we get the mention of the lottery. We don't know anything about what this lottery is, but we do get the lottery mentioned twice in that first paragraph. So, that is a little bit of, say, early placement foreshadowing, so to speak. Now, our second paragraph gives us a little bit more information. The children assembled first, of course, because that's what children do, right? They're out there playing. Children like to have fun. School was recently over for the summer, and the feeling of liberty sat uneasily on most of them. I thought that was interesting, and I underlined that. They tended to gather together quietly for a while before they broke into boisterous play, and their talk was still of the classroom and the teacher, of books and reprimands. Bobby Martin had already stuffed his pockets full of stones, and the other boys soon followed his example, selecting the smoothest and roundest stones. Bobby and Harry Jones and Dickie Delacroix, the villagers pronounced this name Delacroix, eventually made a great pile of stones in one corner of the square and guarded against the rays of the other boys. The girls stood aside, talking amongst themselves, looking over their shoulders at the boys, and the very small children rolled in the dust or clung to the hands of their older brothers and sisters. All right. So the second paragraph begins to introduce the people, and there seems to be some sort of hierarchy where we've got children. Later we're going to have the men and then the women. And not only is there sort of hierarchy that's age, but we get a lot of, so the gender separation too. So we have within the children, the boys, and then the girls. And then we have that later mirrored with the adults as well. We get our first mention of the stones in this particular paragraph. And we get quite a bit about the stones. At this point in the reading, you don't really know what those stones are. You probably think they're just, that's what kids play with. But, again, there's a little bit of foreshadowing, and we have the kids already knowing what to do with the stones, it seems like. All right, so if we come here, we talked about the setting. We have kind of our main characters in this story. There are a lot of characters, but who are mentioned, a lot of family names. But we'll talk about kind of the ones that get early mention and also seem to be more important within the story. So we have the Martin family, who the Mr. Martin is a grocer, and then Bobby Martin gets that early mention. He's the first named character in the story, I believe. Let's see, let's go ahead and pull that big. Oops, on this page. Yes, he is the first named character in this story. Okay. Then we've got Mr. Summers, who is, we learn in the next page, is sort of the keeper of the lottery, and that's interesting. We'll talk about that in a second. But he also I think he runs the coal business. Then we have Mr. Graves, the Graves family, which is he's the postmaster. We have Old Man Warner called out, who's the oldest man in the village, so sort of the keeper of the memories of the village, if you will, and traditions. And then the Hutchinson family, obviously, is going to come into play as super important. All right. So if we're talking about literary elements that come into play in this story, we have, and this is just a few of them, but foreshadowing is a big deal. We get that early mention of the stone. We early mention of the lottery. The The black box seems ominous. That sort of foreshadows what happens. This, like I said, the stones themselves. Then Tessie Hutchinson being late to and being almost like she seems very talkative and I don't know, like that mention that she has, I guess, you wouldn't have me leave my dishes in the sink. Feels like foreshadowing that she knows she's got to have her business wrapped up, so to speak. Irony is important. Situational irony in this case, because the setting is so idyllic and warm and normal. What follows is so unexpected from this small town village, everyday American village. Setting mood and tone is important. Again, it's a normal setting, and it's a very objective mood. It just feels like someone recounting the everyday, so that when we get the discussion of the stoning at the very end, again, being very objective in the way it's presented, it feels wrong. It's a strange juxtaposition, if you will. Okay. Symbolism, obviously we've got the black box. I had some of my students in my in-person class think about the black box as being symbolic for a coffin. It feels like a coffin. It could be symbolic for ritual and tradition. It's an interesting thing, the black box. And then the stones themselves are symbolic, I think, for really for the violence within this village that feels primitive in a sense. The black spot is clearly symbolic. The black spot is never a good thing. When you get marked with a spot and a black spot, it's always the sign that something bad is going to happen, usually related to death somehow. And then some of our names are symbolic, like Delacroix, Delacroix, the French, is literally means of the cross. So if we think about some of this, what happens in some of the word choices that are used, it does have somewhat of a biblical feel to it, a definite kind of primitive feel to it. Graves and Summer, those two names are also oddly juxtaposed and yet symbolic. So then there is an allusion, in other words, a reference to something. In this case, Tessie Hutchinson, her name itself and her actions seems to allude to a real historical figure by the name of Anne Hutchinson, who was a Puritan in the 17th century in Massachusetts, who questioned the rightness of the Puritan teachings, and also the kind of the gender roles, the stereotypical gender roles that women were expected to be subservient to their husbands, and she was eventually banished and cast out of her small town. So that sort of, you can see that connection with Tessie. All right. So things to think about as you are reading this story and writing your discussion board. It's deceptively simple. It fools you. You don't really know what you're reading. You don't really understand what happens until it happens. You want to think about this inherent violence within the society. Again, going back to that first page with Bobby Martin, so quick to pick up the stones and hoard them, and he and his friends. This idea of groupthink and accepting the ritual for the sake of the tradition and not really remembering anything about the ritual anymore. Let's go back and talk about this. So it's deceptively simple because early on here we have this, on the second page, this paragraph on the lottery itself. The lottery was conducted, as were the square dances, the teenage club, the Halloween program by Mr. Summers, who had time and energy to devote to civic activities. So the lottery is cast early on as just another civic activity that no one really thinks too much about. Mr. Summers seems to reflect his name, being a round-faced, jovial man. And so we also get, again, here's where I talk about foreshadowing with the black box. The villagers kept their distance, leaving a space between themselves and the stool that the black box was on. When Mr. Summers said, "Some of you fellows want to give me a hand," there was a hesitation before two men came forward to hold the box steady. No one seems to want to be near the black box. No one really remembers much about the black box, but no one wants to think about it much once the lottery is done for the year. All right. So again, here we go. Things to think about. Then the title itself is ironic in that what? A lottery is usually seen as somehow positive. In this case, it's not. It's definitely not a good thing. It's not a happy thing or a positive thing. And you wonder, how willingly are people participating in this? Another thing is, how does point of view, in this case, this third-person objective point of view, how does it contribute to the mood of the story? How does it take something so ordinary and make it so ominous? All right. So if we go back to this idea of the ritual, because there's a lot of discussion in the story of the ritual, it seems somehow tied to agriculture and crops and tradition. There's that saying that old man Warner says, when other towns are thinking of banishing the lottery, so we get this notion that, does this have to be, why are these people doing this? Why do these people do this year after year, where clearly someone gets stoned to death year after year? For what purpose? But people don't seem to want to question it very much. Tessie questioned it. She was immediately othered when she questioned whether it was fair. People were like, no, go on. You had your chance just like me. So that's something to think about. So if we look at that questioning that Tessie has, I have it highlighted, some of the interactions where Tessie says it wasn't fair. Mrs. Delacroix says, and Mrs. Graves said, hey, be a good sport. We all took the same chance. She's going to get stoned to death, and they know it, and Tessie knows it. We don't know it as a reader yet, but we're getting the feeling that being chosen wasn't necessarily a good thing. Here we go. And the last thing her husband says to her is shut up, as she's getting ready to, or they're all getting ready to possibly be the one who's going to get stoned to death. Then again, here Tessie complains and says it wasn't fair. And in this particular case, here we have the black spot right here being sort of marking her out. Let me move it down here. Okay, so Bill Hutchinson went over to his wife and forced the slip of paper out of her hand. That feels violent right there. It had a black spot on it. The black spot Mr. Summers had made the night before with the heavy pencil in the coal company office. So she's stained, she's marked out. Okay. And then here we have the description of the villagers had forgotten the ritual, lost the original black box, but they remembered the violence. They remembered the stones. And they even give little Davy Hutchinson a stone to stone his mother with. And Tessie Hutchinson to the end says it isn't fair. It just isn't fair. A stone hit her on the side of the head. Old man Warner was saying, come on, everyone. Steve Adams was in the front of the crowd of villagers with Mrs. Graves beside him. isn't fair, it isn't right," Mrs. Hutchinson screamed, and then they were upon her. So, if we go back and we think about the stoning itself, it's interesting because, first of all, stoning, it seems like a fertility ritual. Remember the stoning in June, corn heavy soon. But fertility rituals don't usually involve a stoning. They do often involve like a death, but often it may have to do with like a bleeding, in other words, like a fertilizing type situation. But in most cases, stonings are a type of capital punishment for something done wrong, in which case we see Tessie being pointed out as some kind of scapegoat, bearing the blame for others. But that's a question you want to ask yourself. What kind of blame is she bearing? What has she done wrong? Has she spoken out too soon? I don't know. So, themes present within this story, we can think about the power of tradition, the importance of family structure, gender roles in society, the questioning of authority, the ability for human violence. So those are all things that you can kind of be questioning in terms of themes. Finally, the one thing I want you to take away and ask yourself is, how might you connect this story with the one we just read in The Pedestrian? What similarities and themes can you see? I want you to think about that, because when we go to write our literary analysis essay, you're going to end up doing a comparison contrast essay. So you'll have to choose 2 stories of the 4 that we've read and make some kind of comparison between the 2. So you want to start asking yourself, does The Pedestrian work in tandem with this story? We have 2 more stories to come, don't forget, but this is something to kind of be prepping for. All right. Hope you enjoy your discussion.